All right. So we've been looking at Job. We've been looking at Job and studying Job for quite a few weeks. We're ending today with the three debates that he has with his friends. And basically, he is in the middle of his answer, his final answer to his three friends. Last week, we looked at wisdom and how Job is in the search for wisdom. And today, we're going to finish with the last three chapters of his response to his friends. Job 29, 30, and 31. And the question that I have for you to begin with is, who does Job talk to? Who does he talk to? And I believe that he's not only talking to his friends, it is clear that he's talking also to God. A lot of his answers to his friends turn to a conversation to God. But then there's a lot of conversations that are going on between Job and himself. Some of us may experience some of this. If you look at the screen right now, you may be familiar with some of those images. Some of us have an inner voice. And I say some of us, and honestly, most humans do this. Some may not be aware. Some may not be willing to say. Some people may be afraid that others are going to think that they're crazy, because sometimes you have an inner voice and you have this voice inside of you, which is a very good voice. For instance, about 20 years ago, that voice kept me going, running, so that I could run 3 miles under 18 minutes every day. When I was younger playing soccer, I had to keep up with those metrics. That's the same voice that probably Shelby hears when she's practicing volleyball. That's the same voice that maybe some of you that like hiking, like Sharon, sometimes you may be tired, but it tells you, hey, keep going, keep going. That's the same voice that this morning you wake up and you see the rain outside, but it tells you, let's get up. Let's continue with life. Let's go and worship God together. Let's get out of bed. Let's go to work. Let's do this. Let's keep driving even though I'm really sleepy. And that's the voice in your head. Don't fall asleep. And you have a conversation with your head, in your head, with yourself. Now, that same voice that can be used for so many positive and good things, sometimes it plays tricks on us. And sometimes it's not very positive. Sometimes that voice inside of us is not very optimistic. Sometimes that voice in our heads is not having a good day. And sometimes it tells us the opposite. Why keep going? Why get up? Why do this? Why do that? And so, one of the questions that I have for you is, what does Job talk about? In chapter 28, he spoke about wisdom. In chapter 29, he's going to speak about his past. In chapter 30, he's going to speak about his present. And in chapter 31, he makes a prediction. Basically, a little bit about the future. I just didn't want to use the word future because it begins with F. And I wanted to keep it uniform with all words beginning with the letter P. So he speaks about his past, his present, and then he makes a prediction. In chapter 29, Job is going to talk about a little bit about his past. And he does this like reminiscence, like when you think about your past years and those wonderful years that you lived before, and you start comparing them to now, to the present, and you say, when I was this, when I was that, when I was younger. Some of us may even think, when I had a better relationship with God. You may have felt that. And Job does the same. See, Job says, I remember those days when God watched over me, when I went out to the city gate. And now, verses 7 and a little bit around there, you may start feeling like, is he a humble person? Because in verse 7, he says, when I went out to the city gate, took my seat. He says in verse 9, city officials stopped talking and covered their mouths with their hands. In verse 11, people spoke well of me. Those who saw me commended me. So it's a little bit, uh, you may take it as, is this a little bit arrogant? But he's just remembering all the great things that he experienced before. He's talking about his past. Verse 15, he starts speaking about, I was this and I was that. And sometimes that happens to us. We remember how in some time of our life we were that, or we were, to some other people, we were different. And now we start thinking of ourselves a little bit down. He says in verse 21, people listen to me. When I smiled, he says, my face was precious to people. I chose the way for them. I dwelt as a king. I was like one who comforts mourners. And that's how chapter 29 ends. If you just read chapter 29, you're going to think, what's going on with Job? And basically, he talks about his past in chapter 29 to speak about his present condition, his current condition in chapter 30. He says, but now, and that's how chapter 30 begins. And that's when it makes sense. Oh, he's talking about his past in chapter 29 so that he can talk about his present now. And he says, but now they mock me. Verse 9, and now they mock me in some. Verse 11, now God is doing this to me. Verse 16, now life is going away from me. And verse 20, I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. Verse 28, I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. He calls his friends jackals in verse 29. Also, he calls them ostriches, which is very strong language. And then verse 31, to finish the chapter, he says that his music is basically all about mourning and sadness. Not very positive. You see, that the voice that Job has right now is turning into very negative, pessimistic, thinking about his past, about his future, about his present. Now he makes a prediction in chapter 31. So verse 5, he says, if I have, and I underline if I have, because this chapter could have also been called the ifs. If I have been this. Verse 6, then let God weigh me. Verse 7, if my steps. Verse 9, if my heart. Verse 13, if I have done this. If I have denied justice to my servants. And verse 14, I love verse 14. That is the question. Two questions right there for us. He says, what will I do when God confronts me? What will I answer when called to account? Which many of us ask ourselves that question. What will happen when the trumpet sounds, when the end comes, when our life on earth ends? What will happen when I face Jesus? If I have been this, or if I have been that. And he continues. Verse 16, if I have denied the poor. Verse 17, if I have been selfish. Verse 19, if I have not looked for the poor, those who don't have clothing. And you read this, verses 16 and 17 and 19, and you remember Jesus in Matthew 25. And people ask Jesus, when did we see you without clothing? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you without shelter? And then Jesus says, because you took care of others. It's like you were doing it to me. And so Job has this idea that he hasn't been any of that. If I have raised my hand against the fatherless, verse 21. If I have, verse 24, put my trust in gold. Verse 25. If I have rejoiced about my wealth. Verse 29. If I have rejoiced at my enemy's misfortune. So many of that from the Sermon of the Mountain. We can draw parallels there. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. In how Jesus says, love your enemies. And Job didn't even rejoice at his enemy's misfortune. Verse 35. If only I had someone to hear my case. Here's my signature. It's like Job is signing a contract. He says, I am signing off. Here's my signature. Let the Almighty God answer me. And verse 40 says, the words of Job are concluded. And that's how Job ends. Job talked about his past, he talked about his present condition, and now he makes a prediction. And his prediction is, if I've been really bad and I'm suffering because of that, if my friends are telling me that I'm suffering because I did something wrong, something against God, which I deny, but if they're right, then I will perish. But if I've been all of that, but Job tries to make a defense. He tries to defend his integrity. And he says, you know what? I don't think I've been any of those things. I don't think I've been that bad. And his speech, when he talks to his friends, to God and to himself, begins changing. And says, yes, the past was great. The present is not so much. But I still believe that God, the Almighty, will answer me. I'm signing off. And that's it. And so there's this inner voice that I see in Job talking not only to his friends and to God, but talking to himself. And sometimes I ask myself and I say, what is that inner voice? The one that I have. What does it look like? Who does it sound like? I'm 41 years old, and sometimes when I talk to myself, there's a voice, there are some words, some expressions, some reactions. I don't know if this happens to you. I make a mistake, I drop something, and then I say something to myself, and I started noticing that for a very long time I've been saying words and expressions to myself when I make those things, like make mistakes, that don't really sound like me. I mean, they do sound like me now with my voice, but it sounded like somebody else from the past. See, sometimes we can start learning about ourselves if what we're saying to ourselves is something that comes from God or comes from somebody else and we just learned it. And I've thought about myself, and I was doing this in therapy. Actually, I was asked this by the psychologist. She asked me, Diego, what would you say? What would you say to your younger Diego? What would you say? And I just thought about it for a second, and I said, I would probably hug little kid Diego when I was younger. I would hug and I would say, hey, it's okay. And I've thought about that as I'm a father now. I have a 4-year-old, Noah, who will turn 5 in December, and he's very excited about that. And every time Noah does something, I have the option. I am aware now that what I say to him will probably affect how he talks to himself when he's my age, when he's 41. and that has been tremendously impactful this summer for me. I've spent lots of time with my sons, which has been a blessing, but it has also made me pay attention to the voice inside my head and to wonder who is talking to me. Is it me? Is that voice from God? Or is that voice some voice that I learned from the past? I found two books. One of them is Voice Therapy by Robert Firestone, and he developed this to help people manage destructive inner voices. So if this is something that you relate to, great. And if not, I'm sorry. You're like, this is boring. But if this is something you relate to, or you know people that may sometimes have destructive inner voices, those voices that say you're no good, etc., then this will be helpful. He argued that these inner voices are often negative and critical and are derived from the voices of influential figures from our past. His therapeutic approach involves helping people recognize the origin and nature of these critical thoughts. And I started reading this other book, Chatter, by Ethan Kross. Catherine and I were driving this week through Michigan, and I saw the sign, the University of Michigan. I was like, oh, cool. There's the University of Michigan. Um, and then I found, oh, Ethan Kross is a professor at the University of Michigan. Anyway, so he's an expert on controlling the conscious mind, and he is a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. He authored this book, Chatter, which explores the purpose of our inner voice and its impact on our emotions, motivation, and well-being. His research focuses on practical tools for managing negative self-talk and transforming the inner critic into an inner coach. And I was like, I need that. I need my inner voice to stop being a critic. I don't need more critics in my life. And hey, Diego, I'm firing you. Let's bring a new Diego in who is a coach. After all, I've been a coach. I'm a soccer coach. I still coach my son. This is the third season. I want a coach in here. I don't want a critic. And so I started reading the book, and it has been helpful. Let me tell you this, and you may already know this, but I just want to remind you. What you say to yourself matters. Just know that. Yes, others may say things to you, and you may care, you may not. But hey, what do you say to yourself? What you say and how you talk to yourself, that does matter. If you're the type of person that is very critical of yourself, if you're the type of person that is a mea culpa all the time, that matters. And how you treat yourself does matter. I've experienced this firsthand. Maybe it didn't originate within me. Maybe it was somebody else's voice. But hey, all I can do now at my 41 years of age is, hey, what can I do about this? And how can I transform that inner voice? How can I change what I say to myself, how I say it, and how I treat myself? I cannot depend on how others treat me. And so I want to finish today, as I usually do, making a very important connection and application to the gospel and to Jesus. And I just want to share a verse with you. Philippians 2:5. Philippians 2:5 says, have the same, and it's got a Greek word there, phroneo. Have the same phroneo as Jesus. And one of the beautiful things about this word, phroneo, is that it can mean multiple things. I just want to share three of them with you really quick. have the same mindset as Jesus. Some other translations say mentality as Jesus. And that is really important because it started when I started reading this verse, and I actually learned this from our friend Chase Turner many years ago. He taught this class in Costa Rica about phroneo. I think that was early 2010s, somewhere in there, 2014 or so. So it's been over 10 years that I've known this word, phroneo. But the more I think about it, and I'm like, that inner voice that I have, the question that I've been asking myself over the last few days and weeks is, does that voice sound like Jesus? You know that bracelet, What Would Jesus Do? WWJD. What if you put that bracelet in your mind and ask yourself, what would Jesus say to you? See, the psychologist may sit me and say, Diego, what would you say to little Diego? But let me ask you, I know that's funny, right? What would you say to little Diego? But let me ask you this. Really, think about it. What would Jesus say to you? Is that inner voice, the one that you hear sometimes, the one that mistreats you, that inner voice that tells you harsh things? The question is, would Jesus do that? Would Jesus do that? Come into your mind and tell you those things? And if the answer is no, then we got to start sounding more like Jesus. And that's what I want. I want to have an inner voice that is as much as Jesus as possible. Because what I think, how I think, matters. And if I think like Jesus, if I think in the way of Jesus, that will improve my spiritual condition. Number two, this word also means feeling. Now, if you make a connection, what you think will also produce feelings. If you think negatively, you're going to start feeling negatively. And if you think positively, you're going to start thinking positively. To some of you, this is like, Diego, I've known that all my life. But sometimes we don't know that, and sometimes we need to be reminded. And so if we have the same phroneo as Jesus, that would mean that we have the same mind, the same thinking, the same thoughts, which will produce the same feelings as Jesus. And that's what Philippians 2:5 says. And the third one is attitude. The word phroneo also means attitude, which converts into actions. Your attitude will produce behavior. Does that make sense? Your attitude will produce behavior. So how you think of yourself, what you say to yourself, your mindset will produce feelings, how you feel about life, how you feel about yourself, how you feel about others, and it will produce actions, behavior, and then you're going to start acting more like Jesus. And that's when we say, Amen. And you can say it with me and say, Hallelujah. The more I can act like Jesus, bingo, you got it. But it's not just, hey, act more like Jesus. Close the Bible, go out, be more like Jesus. It's hard sometimes. It begins usually up here. It begins with what I tell my kids. I told Catherine this the other day. We have these conversations which are very helpful. I told Catherine, if I start doing this with Noah now, it's too late. She said, what do you mean? I said, it's got to start way back when Noah was Franco's age. What we say to him, what I say to Noah matters. Because in my experience, he will say some of the same things that I say to him as he grows up. And so, make your inner voice the voice of Jesus. And that is my invitation. Why? Why is that my invitation? Why do I say make your inner voice the voice of Jesus? I said this last week and I want to repeat it. The best invitation that we can offer is to be like Jesus. So my invitation to you today, my invitation to you this morning is to start being more like Jesus. Same invitation as last week. But how do you start doing that? Job had suffering, pain in his life, and then he had to realize this voice that I have in my head is coming from the people around me, is coming from my relationship with God, and now I have to make a decision for myself. So Job had to make a decision. Job had to make a decision about what kind of voice he had in his head. What is going to be his inner speech, his inner voice. You can make a decision as well. It may not be totally different by the morning. It may not happen overnight. But what you start saying to yourself, how you start treating yourself, if it's more like Jesus, that will help you a lot in your inner voice, in your spirituality, in your relationship with others. And you will end up being more like Jesus. I hope this lesson is applicable to you as it is to me. Thank you for your time, and may God bless you.